His grandfather David was a warrior king, loved by his people, chosen by God. His father Solomon was the wisest man to ever live, building Israel into a golden empire. And then there was Rehoboam, a king without his grandfather's heart, a ruler without his father's wisdom, a man who inherited everything, only to lose it all in days. If you think success is guaranteed just because of your family name, this story will shake you. If you've ever ignored wise advice because you thought you knew better, Rehoboam is the warning you never knew you needed. The moment he took the throne, he faced a choice, one decision that could unite his kingdom or break it apart. And when that moment came, he made the worst mistake possible. One act of arrogance, one refusal to listen, and in an instant Israel shattered into pieces, never to be whole again. We will uncover the warnings Solomon ignored about his own son, the fateful day Rehoboam became king and how he threw it all away, the division of Israel, how 10 tribes abandoned him and formed a new kingdom, the lessons we must learn today because leaders still make these mistakes. This is a story of pride, rebellion, and regret, a story of how kingdoms fall. Timestamps are in the description so you can jump to key moments in the story. Now let's dive into Rehoboam's rise and fall like never before. Rehoboam was born into a world of unimaginable wealth, wisdom, and power. His father Solomon had built Israel into the greatest empire it had ever been. Gold lined the streets, silver was as common as stones, and rulers from across the world sought his counsel. The name Solomon was synonymous with wisdom, prosperity, and divine favor. And Rehoboam, he was the son destined to inherit it all. But if history has taught us anything, it's this. Greatness is never guaranteed. Rehoboam may have been Solomon's son, but he was not Solomon. He had his father's crown, but not his father's wisdom. He had access to the world's greatest teachers, but he learned nothing. He grew up in palaces filled with knowledge, yet he remained ignorant. And the one thing he needed most, humility, was nowhere to be found. Unlike his grandfather David, who had fought lions and bears as a shepherd boy, Rehoboam never knew struggle. David had survived years of war, betrayal, and exile before he ever wore a crown. Solomon, though born into royalty, had at least shown a deep hunger for wisdom, pleading with God for understanding as a young king. But Rehoboam, he grew up knowing nothing but privilege. He never had to fight for his place. He never had to seek wisdom. He never had to struggle. He was surrounded by servants who answered his every command, advisors who praised his every word, and wealth that made any hardship a distant foreign concept. This was a prince raised in silk, not in battle. A future king who had never tasted failure. And so, when his first test came, he did not know how to face it. Many wonder, did Solomon ever see the warning signs in his son? Solomon, the wisest man in history, wrote countless proverbs about the importance of wisdom, humility, and listening to good counsel. Did he see Rehoboam's arrogance? Did he notice his son's unwillingness to listen? Perhaps he did. But Solomon, for all his wisdom, also made devastating mistakes as a father. The truth is, Solomon had a weakness, his many wives and their influence. With 700 wives and 300 concubines, his household was massive, filled with political alliances, competing loyalties, and foreign gods. Many of these wives worshipped idols, and Solomon himself had begun building temples to their false gods. The man who once built the great temple of the Lord had now built shrines to Baal, Ashtoreth, and Molech. He had compromised, and that compromise may have extended to his parenting. Did Solomon spoil Rehoboam? Did he turn a blind eye to his son's arrogance? Did he pour all his wisdom into the kingdom, yet fail to pass it down to his own child? Whatever the reason, by the time Solomon died, Rehoboam was not prepared to be king. He was entitled, reckless, and completely blind to what leadership required. Rehoboam may not have realized it, but the kingdom his father left him was already in danger. Under Solomon's reign, Israel had become powerful, but that power had come at a cost. To maintain his extravagant wealth, Solomon had placed heavy taxes and labor burdens on the people. 4 years, the people had endured it, hoping the golden age would last. But when Solomon died, something changed. The people were tired, they were restless, they wanted relief. And this would be Rehoboam's first great test. Would he listen, or would he rule with a fist of iron? The answer to that question would define the rest of his life, and it would change Israel forever. Rehoboam stood at the threshold of power. The golden crown of Israel mere moments from being placed upon his head. The grand halls of Jerusalem had seen two legendary kings before him, David, the warrior king, and Solomon, the wise builder. But this was no ordinary coronation. This was not a day of pure celebration. There was tension in the air, an unease rippling through the kingdom like a coming storm. To the untrained eye, Israel still seemed as mighty as ever. The kingdom stretched from Dan to Beersheba. The temple stood in all its splendor, and the economy had once been the envy of the world. But beneath the surface, cracks had already begun to form. The people were restless. Decades of Solomon's heavy taxation and forced labor had drained them. The lavish palaces, the gold-plated thrones, the fleets of chariots, all had come at a cost. And now, as Rehoboam prepared to take the throne, the people of Israel came with one request. Tradition dictated that Israel's kings were confirmed in Jerusalem, the capital, the city of David, the center of power. But when it came time for Rehoboam's coronation, the leaders of the tribes did not gather in Jerusalem. Instead, they called him to Shechem. This was not an accident. Shechem was a city of deep historical and spiritual significance. It was where Joshua had led the people in renewing their covenant with God. It was a place of decision, a place where history had been made before. And now, history would be made again. But this time, it would not be in Rehoboam's favor. When the young king arrived, he was not met with simple pledges of loyalty. He was not greeted with the blind obedience he expected. Instead, he was met with a challenge. The people, led by a man named Jeroboam, stood before him and spoke with one voice. "Your father made our yoke heavy. Now therefore, lighten the burdensome service of your father and his heavy yoke which he put on us, and we will serve you." Among those gathered in Shechem stood a man who had once been forced into exile, Jeroboam. He was no stranger to Solomon's court. Years earlier, a prophet had approached him with a stunning prophecy. "Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes. When Solomon heard this, he sought to kill Jeroboam. And the man fled to Egypt, waiting for his time. Now, with Solomon dead, he had returned, and he was not alone. Jeroboam represented the 10 northern tribes, the majority of Israel's population. Their demand was simple: ease the burden, and we will be loyal. Reduce the taxes, lighten the labor, and the kingdom will remain united. It was the perfect moment for Jeroboam to show wisdom, to listen, to unite the people under his rule. But arrogance would be his undoing. Jeroboam did something that seemed wise at first. He did not answer immediately. Instead, he told the people, "Come back to me in 3 days." During this time, he sought advice. First, he turned to the elders who had served his father Solomon. These men had witnessed the rise and golden age of Israel. They had seen prosperity, but they also understood the people's suffering. Their advice was clear. If you will be a servant to these people today, and serve them, and answer them, and speak good words to them, then they will be your servants forever. It was the perfect strategy, one of humility, wisdom, and strength. If Jeroboam had listened, he could have secured his kingdom, just as his father and grandfather had done before him. But he rejected their words. Instead, he turned to his childhood friends, the young men who had grown up in the palace with him, who had never known hardship, who had only ever known privilege. And their advice was very different. They told him, "Forget about lowering taxes. Increase them. Show the people who's in charge." Their exact words. "Thus you shall say to them, my little finger shall be thicker than my father's waist. My father put a heavy yoke on you. I will make it even heavier. My father chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions." This was no longer just rejection. It was insult. It was provocation. It was an open act of tyranny. Rehoboam, blinded by arrogance, returned to the people and delivered these very words. And in that moment, his kingdom shattered. The reaction was immediate and explosive. The people of Israel revolted. The 10 northern tribes, who had tolerated Solomon's rule only out of loyalty, now declared their independence. They refused to be ruled by a man who would not listen. They crowned Jeroboam as their king and broke away, forming a new kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. Only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin remained loyal to Rehoboam, forming what would be known as the Kingdom of Judah. And just like that, Israel was no longer one nation. The kingdom that David had fought for, the golden age Solomon had built, gone in a single moment of pride. To your tents, O Israel! Look after your own house, O David! The words rang out like an earthquake, and the kingdom was never the same again. In just 3 days, Rehoboam destroyed everything his father and grandfather had built. He proved that leadership is not about power. It is about wisdom. It is about listening, about knowing when to serve and when to stand firm. Rehoboam had a choice, to unite or divide, to humble himself or exalt himself. And he chose wrongly. But this was only the beginning of his troubled reign. The loss of 10 tribes was just the first disaster. More was coming, and it would only get worse. The dust had barely settled from Rehoboam's coronation, but the kingdom was already on the verge of collapse. One sentence, one reckless decision had done what no foreign army had ever achieved, dividing the once mighty kingdom of Israel into 2 warring nations. It didn't take long for the realization to sink in. Rehoboam had lost the north. 10 tribes had walked away, declaring independence under Jeroboam's leadership. The great throne of David, once ruling over all of Israel, now controlled only Judah and Benjamin. But Rehoboam was not ready to accept this reality. He was the son of Solomon. He was the heir to David's throne. And he was about to make his second catastrophic mistake, one that would cost even more lives. Rehoboam had a chance to pause, a chance to listen, a chance to reconsider. But instead, he chose war. In his mind, this was not a rebellion. It was treason. The throne of Israel belonged to David's line, and he would not let it be stolen by Jeroboam, an exiled servant of his father. The moment the 10 tribes declared their independence, Rehoboam began preparing for battle. With rage burning in his heart, he gathered 180,000 warriors from Judah and Benjamin, an army large enough to crush the rebellion and bring Israel back under his control. He would not be the king who lost his father's empire. But then something happened that no one expected. As Rehoboam stood on the brink of war, God intervened. A prophet named Shemaiah appeared before him with a message that cut through the king's pride. This is what the Lord says. You must not go up to fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. In that moment, the truth became undeniable. This division was not just a political mistake. It was judgment. Solomon had led Israel into idolatry. He had turned from God, despite all the wisdom and blessings he had received. Now his son was paying the price. For the first time, Rehoboam did something wise. He listened. He called off the war, sending his troops back to their homes. But the damage was already done. The kingdom was divided, and it would never be won again. As Judah tried to recover from the shock of losing 10 tribes, Jeroboam wasted no time securing his new kingdom. He knew that as long as the temple in Jerusalem remained the center of worship, people from the north would continue traveling south to make sacrifices. And if they kept going to Jerusalem, they might eventually regret breaking away. So he did something unthinkable. Jeroboam built 2 golden calves, one in Bethel and one in Dan, and told the people of Israel, "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." It was the same sin from the days of Moses, a golden calf, a false god, an act of defiance, and Rehoboam, he did nothing. The man who was once ready to go to war over his pride now stood back as idolatry spread like wildfire in the north. Instead of leading a spiritual revival in Judah, he allowed paganism and corruption to seep into his own kingdom. For the first time since the days of David, Israel and Judah were enemies. 2 kings, 2 nations, one great mistake. Even after the division, Rehoboam did not humble himself. Instead of strengthening Judah spiritually, he focused on fortifying his cities. He built walls, stored up weapons, and prepared for war, believing that military power would keep his kingdom secure. But his real enemy wasn't Jeroboam, it was God. In the 5th year of his reign, disaster struck. The Egyptian pharaoh Shishak invaded Judah. With an army of 1,200 chariots and 60,000 horsemen, the Egyptian forces swept through the land, destroying city after city. The great fortifications Rehoboam had built, useless. Before long, Shishak's army stood at the gates of Jerusalem. This was no ordinary invasion, this was divine judgment. Rehoboam had abandoned God, so now God allowed his enemies to rise against him. Shemaiah, the same prophet who had stopped Rehoboam from going to war, returned with another message. You have abandoned the Lord, therefore he has abandoned you to Shishak. At that moment, something finally broke inside Rehoboam. The king, who had once refused to listen, now did the one thing he had never done before. He humbled himself. He and the leaders of Judah fell before God and admitted their guilt. And because of this, God spared them from total destruction. But there was still a price to pay. Shishak did not destroy Jerusalem, but he did loot the temple of God. All the gold shields, treasures, and sacred objects Solomon had placed there, gone. The grandeur of the temple, the symbol of God's blessing on Israel, was stripped away. And Rehoboam, instead of repenting further, he replaced the stolen gold shields with cheap bronze ones. Rather than fixing the spiritual decay in Judah, he simply covered it up. Rehoboam had everything he needed to be a great king. He had the blood of David. He had the wisdom of Solomon as his heritage. He had a united kingdom placed in his hands. But he lost it all because of pride, arrogance, and refusal to listen. One decision shattered the greatest kingdom in Israel's history. One refusal to humble himself brought foreign invaders to his gates. One act of stubbornness turned God from his ally into his enemy. But perhaps the greatest tragedy is that Rehoboam's story didn't have to end this way. He had warnings. He had chances to repent. He had opportunities to lead Judah back to God. And yet he never fully did. His father Solomon had started strong and ended in failure. Rehoboam, he never even started well. And because of this, his kingdom was never the same again. Rehoboam's reign would continue, but his kingdom would never recover. The golden age of Israel was over. But his story isn't just about one bad king. It's about all of us. How many times do we refuse to listen? How many times do we let pride blind us to the truth? How many times do we fight for the wrong things and ignore what really matters? Rehoboam's mistakes are warnings for every leader, every decision-maker, and every person who thinks they know better than wisdom itself. The kingdom of Israel was never meant to be divided. It was the great promise given to Abraham, established through Moses, and made glorious under David and Solomon. 12 tribes, one nation, one God. But all of that changed the moment Rehoboam spoke his infamous words. My father disciplined you with whips. I will discipline you with scorpions. At that moment, the people of Israel had heard enough. They turned their backs on Rehoboam and placed their trust in a new king. His name was Jeroboam, and his rise would mark the beginning of a divided Israel, a new kingdom, and a spiritual disaster that would last for generations. Jeroboam's story didn't begin with rebellion. It began with prophecy. Long before Solomon's death, while he was still ruling over a united Israel, a prophet named Ahijah approached Jeroboam with a shocking revelation. Ahijah took off his brand-new cloak, ripped it into 12 pieces, and handed 10 of them to Jeroboam. Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I'm going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. It was a promise, but also a warning. Solomon had led Israel into idolatry. His foreign wives had introduced false gods, and the kingdom that was supposed to belong to the Lord had become a place of compromise. So, God would tear it apart. Jeroboam was not just a random rebel. God himself had chosen him. If he followed God, he could establish a dynasty as strong as David's. But would he listen? When Solomon heard of this prophecy, he did what every power-hungry ruler does. He tried to eliminate the threat. Jeroboam, once a respected official in Solomon's government, was now a wanted man. With no other choice, he fled to Egypt, where he lived under the protection of Pharaoh Shishak. 4 years, Jeroboam waited, watching, learning, preparing. Then came the news he had been waiting for. Solomon was dead, and now it was time to claim his kingdom. The northern tribes had always had a complicated relationship with Jerusalem. David had united them. Solomon had kept them in check. But Rehoboam, He shattered their trust in an instant. So, when the people heard that Jeroboam had returned from Egypt, they saw an alternative. A leader who wasn't part of the corrupt royal family. A leader who understood their struggles. A leader who could take Israel in a new direction. And just like that, Jeroboam became king over 10 tribes. Israel was now 2 nations. The great kingdom of David and Solomon had been ripped in half. Jeroboam was now the ruler of the northern kingdom of Israel. Rehoboam still ruled in Jerusalem over Judah and Benjamin. But Jeroboam had a problem. Even though the people had rejected Rehoboam, the heart of Israel's faith was still in Jerusalem. The temple, where all Israelites were required to worship, was still in Rehoboam's territory. Jeroboam feared that if his people continued to go to Jerusalem to worship, their loyalty might return to David's dynasty. And so, he made a decision that would curse his kingdom for generations. He built 2 golden calves. He placed one in Bethel, the southernmost city in his kingdom, and one in Dan at the northern border. Then he gathered the people and said these shocking words. "It is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." History was repeating itself. This was the same sin that doomed Israel in the wilderness. The same idolatry that had angered God in the days of Moses. But Jeroboam didn't stop there. He created his own priesthood, rejecting the Levites. He established new festivals, altering God's appointed times. He invented his own religion, one that would keep the people away from Jerusalem. And the worst part, it worked. The people of Israel followed him. They abandoned the temple, embraced Jeroboam's false worship, and turned their backs on the God who had saved them. Jeroboam had secured his kingdom, but he had doomed his soul. Jeroboam thought he had won. His political strategy had secured his throne. His religious system had kept the people under his control. But he had forgotten one thing. God never forgets. Not long after Jeroboam built the golden calves, a prophet appeared. He stood before Jeroboam as he was offering sacrifices at Bethel and declared judgment on his kingdom. A son named Josiah will be born to the house of David. On you, altar, he will sacrifice the priests of the high places who make offerings here, and human bones will be burned on you. At that moment, the altar split apart. Jeroboam, enraged, reached out his hand to seize the prophet. His hand shriveled up. God had spoken. Jeroboam was terrified. He begged for mercy, and the prophet prayed for his healing. But even after witnessing this miracle, Jeroboam refused to change. And so his dynasty was doomed. Years later, his son would die as a sign of God's judgment. His descendants would be wiped out, and his name would forever be remembered as the king who led Israel into sin. Jeroboam's reign marked the beginning of Israel's downward spiral. From this point forward, every king of Israel followed in his footsteps, worshipping idols, rejecting God, and leading the people deeper into sin. And the saddest part, it all started because Jeroboam was afraid to trust God. He had been given a kingdom by divine prophecy. He had been offered a dynasty like David's. He had been chosen to lead God's people. But instead of relying on God, he relied on politics, deception, and fear. And because of that, his kingdom was cursed. Rehoboam ruled in the south. Jeroboam ruled in the north. And Israel would never be the same again. But the story isn't over. The division would lead to wars, betrayals, and judgment. And both kings, Rehoboam and Jeroboam, would learn the cost of rebellion. The moment Rehoboam refused to listen to his people, his fate was sealed. Half of his kingdom walked away that day. What had once been the mighty unified empire of Israel under David and Solomon was now 2 separate nations, Judah in the south and Israel in the north. But for Rehoboam, the nightmare was just beginning. He was still a king, but without the strength and power that had once belonged to his father. He still sat on the throne, but without the people who had once feared and honored him. He ruled, but without their loyalty. He was a king without his people. And as we will see, his reign would be marked by war, failure, and the slow collapse of everything he once thought was unshakable. Rehoboam had just lost 10 tribes. His great kingdom had been ripped in half. But he wasn't about to accept defeat. Immediately after the rebellion, Rehoboam gathered an army of 180,000 men, preparing to go to war with Jeroboam and take back his kingdom. This would have been a disaster. Israel had already made up its mind. They no longer saw Rehoboam as their king. If he marched into their land, he wouldn't be reclaiming the throne. He would be starting a civil war. But before he could launch his attack, a prophet named Shemaiah appeared, and he delivered a message that stopped Rehoboam in his tracks. This is what the Lord says. Do not go up to fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. God himself had allowed the kingdom to be torn apart. Rehoboam had been arrogant. He had been reckless. He had refused to listen. And this was the consequence. For the first time, Rehoboam did something surprising. He listened. Instead of fighting, he backed down. Instead of waging war, he focused on strengthening the kingdom he still had left. But while he was trying to rebuild, Jeroboam was making alliances with Egypt. Soon, Rehoboam would learn that losing his kingdom to Jeroboam was only the beginning, because Judah was about to face its greatest threat yet. For 5 years, Rehoboam ruled over a broken kingdom. The economy was not what it once was. The military was not what it once was. The morale of the people was not what it once was. And worst of all, Rehoboam abandoned God. The moment he realized that he couldn't take back Israel, he turned away from the Lord. He allowed idols to creep into Judah. He permitted pagan shrines to be built throughout the land. He let sin and corruption run wild. He had lost half of his kingdom, and now he was about to lose even more. In the 5th year of his reign, Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt launched an invasion against Judah, and Rehoboam never saw it coming. The Egyptian army swept through the land, conquering city after city. Fortresses built by Solomon crumbled in a matter of days. Jerusalem itself was surrounded. Then, the unthinkable happened. Pharaoh marched into the city, walked into the temple, and took all of the treasures Solomon had stored there. The wealth of Israel, the gold, the silver, the sacred items of the temple was now in the hands of a foreign king. And just like that, the glory of Solomon's empire was completely gone. Everything his father had built was now in the hands of Judah's enemies, all because Rehoboam refused to listen. After the Egyptian invasion, Rehoboam was never the same. Instead of golden shields in the palace, he had to replace them with bronze. Instead of ruling with power and wisdom, he ruled with fear and regret. Instead of building something great, he was trying to hold together the pieces of what was left. His reign would last 17 years of conflict with Jeroboam, 17 years of a broken kingdom, 17 years of knowing he would always be remembered as the king who lost it all. At the end of his life, Rehoboam was buried in the city of David, a failed king in the shadow of a great dynasty. But his failure didn't end with him. His son Abijah would take the throne after him, and the war between Judah and Israel would rage on. Rehoboam sat on the throne of Judah, but his kingdom was nothing like his father's. Once, Jerusalem had been the crown jewel of Israel. Now, it was only a fragment of what it had been. Solomon had built a kingdom that stretched from Egypt to the Euphrates. Rehoboam had already lost 10 tribes. He was no longer the ruler of a united Israel, he was a king over a broken nation. But as bad as things were, they were about to get worse. The unimaginable happened. A foreign army one Judah had never expected to fight was marching toward Jerusalem. And this time, there was no David to slay the giant. Before Egypt ever set foot in Judah, Rehoboam had already sealed his fate. The moment he lost Israel, he abandoned God. His father Solomon had turned to idolatry in his later years, but at least he still believed in the Lord. Rehoboam, on the other hand, didn't even try to follow God's ways. Under his reign, pagan altars were built throughout Judah. Foreign gods were openly worshipped in the streets. The people of Israel, once set apart from the nations, had become just like them. And God saw everything. The Lord had been patient with Israel's kings before. He had given warnings and chances to turn back. But not this time. Rehoboam had chosen his own path, and now judgment was coming. The army came suddenly from the south, through the deserts of Sinai. They marched without warning. Chariots rattled against the dry ground. Warriors marched in formation, trained and ready for blood. Egypt's flag flew over a massive force unlike anything Judah had ever faced. And leading them all was Pharaoh Shishak. He was not a man of diplomacy. He was not coming to negotiate. He was coming to conquer. City after city fell. The once powerful fortresses that Solomon had built crumbled in days. The towns that had once prospered under David were looted and burned. And then Jerusalem itself was surrounded, the very heart of Judah, the city of God, the place where the temple stood. Under siege, Rehoboam had no way out. There was no one to save him. His kingdom was weak, and his people were terrified. His army was no match for Pharaoh's forces. And in that moment, he knew this was the price of forsaking God. Jerusalem was not burned to the ground. Pharaoh Shishak spared the city, but not out of kindness. He had something else in mind. He didn't need to destroy Jerusalem. He would humiliate it. He stormed into the city. He entered the royal palace. He walked through the temple itself. And he took everything. The gold, the silver, the treasures Solomon had spent decades accumulating. And worst of all, he took the golden shields of Solomon's guards. These shields had been a symbol of Israel's strength. When Solomon ruled, they gleamed in the sunlight, reflecting the golden age of Israel. But now they belonged to Egypt. And Rehoboam could do nothing. After Pharaoh left, Jerusalem was a different city. It was not a city of power. It was not a city of wealth. It was not a city of glory. It was a city of humiliation. Rehoboam tried to restore order. He replaced the golden shields with bronze ones. He tried to make things look normal. He tried to pretend that everything was fine. But it wasn't fine. The golden age of Israel was over. What had once been a mighty empire was now a weakened kingdom. What had once been a land flowing with wealth was now a city stripped of its treasures. What had once been a throne of honor was now a throne of shame. And everyone knew it. Rehoboam never recovered from this defeat. He would continue to reign for 12 more years, but his rule was nothing like David's or Solomon's. His legacy? Not wisdom, not strength, not victory, but failure. Rehoboam could have been great. He could have been a king who learned from his father's mistakes. He could have been a ruler who listened to the wisdom of his elders. He could have been a leader who followed God. But instead he was a man who refused to listen. A king who lost 10 tribes in a matter of days. A ruler who let idols take over his kingdom. A man who watched his father's wealth stolen before his very eyes. His kingdom was never the same. And neither was Israel. Rehoboam reigned for 17 years, but he never achieved anything great. Instead of expansion, he had loss. Instead of victory, he had shame. Instead of honor, he had regret. And when he died, he was buried in the city of David. But no one remembered him for his greatness. They remembered him as the king who lost everything. But his failure was not the end of Judah's story. His son, Abijah, would take the throne next. And for the first time since the kingdom had been divided, Judah would strike back. Rehoboam had once stood at the edge of greatness. He was the son of Solomon, the grandson of David, the heir to a kingdom unlike any other, a man born into power, wealth, and prestige. But when history remembers him, it doesn't recall his victories. It does not recall his wisdom. It does not recall his greatness. Instead, Rehoboam is remembered for what he lost. The 10 tribes that abandoned him. The empire that collapsed under his rule. The golden shields that were stolen from his palace. He was the king who divided Israel. And when the end of his life came, it was not a triumphant farewell. It was the final chapter of a broken king. Rehoboam ruled for 17 years in Jerusalem. But those years were nothing like his father's reign. Under Solomon, Jerusalem was a city of gold. Under Rehoboam, it was a city of regret. Under David, Israel expanded and conquered. Under Rehoboam, Judah shrank and suffered. Under Solomon, foreign kings and queens came to marvel at Israel's wisdom. Under Rehoboam, foreign kings came to plunder its wealth. Everything that had once made Israel great had faded. And as the years passed, Rehoboam himself faded with it. He had lost Israel. He had lost the treasures of the temple. He had lost the respect of his people. But his greatest loss was still to come. Because in his final years, he lost something even more important than his kingdom. He lost God. If Rehoboam had any opportunity to redeem himself, he never took it. Even after watching his father's empire crumble, even after seeing Egypt humiliate his kingdom, even after experiencing the consequences of ignoring God, he still refused to change. He continued the idolatry Solomon had started. He allowed pagan altars to fill the land. He permitted the worship of false gods, even in the shadow of the temple itself. He knew the God of his fathers. He had heard the stories of David's victories. He understood what would happen to a king who abandoned the Lord. But he did it anyway. And because of this, Judah followed him into sin. They sacrificed at the high places. They bowed before foreign gods. They built shrines to the very idols God had condemned. And God's patience had limits. Judah would not go unpunished forever. By the time Rehoboam reached the end of his life, he was a king in name only. The throne was his, but his kingdom was a shadow of its former self. His palace remained, but his gold had been stolen. His rule continued, but his people no longer trusted him. He had spent his reign reacting to disasters he had caused. He was not a builder like Solomon. He was not a conqueror like David. He was not a man of faith like those who came before him. He was simply a king who let his kingdom fall apart. And when death came for him, it was not a glorious farewell. There were no mighty warriors gathered at his bedside. There were no wise men speaking of his great accomplishments. There were no psalms of victory written in his name. Instead, there was silence, because he had left nothing behind except division. Rehoboam was buried in the city of David, the same place as his father and grandfather. But unlike them, he left behind no legacy worth remembering. David had united Israel. Solomon had built its greatest kingdom. Rehoboam, he had destroyed it. Israel was still divided. The 10 tribes were still gone. Judah was still weak. And worst of all, the division Rehoboam caused would never be repaired. For the rest of Israel's history, the kingdom remained broken. Rehoboam had everything: power, wealth, a kingdom handed to him. But he lost it all. Not because he was weak. Not because he was poor. Not because he was outnumbered. But because he refused to listen. He ignored the elders who warned him. He ignored the lessons of his father and grandfather. And worst of all, he ignored God. His story is a warning to every leader, every nation, and every person who thinks they are untouchable. Because pride leads to destruction. Refusing wisdom leads to ruin. And sometimes, you don't realize what you've lost until it's too late. Rehoboam was gone. His son, Abijah, was about to take the throne. Would he fix his father's mistakes? Would Judah rise again? Or would it fall even further? Rehoboam's name is forever linked to failure. Not because he lost a single battle. Not because he was betrayed by his people. Not because he lacked strength or resources. But because he made the wrong choice at the moment it mattered most. His story is more than just a history lesson. It is a warning. A warning to leaders who refuse wisdom, a warning to nations that ignore the past, warning to anyone who thinks power makes them invincible. Because bad leadership does not just destroy kings. It destroys entire nations. Rehoboam's downfall began with a single decision. The people of Israel had gathered before him, begging for relief. Solomon, for all his wisdom, had placed a heavy burden on the nation, his massive building projects, his high taxes, his forced labor. The people were exhausted, and they had one simple request: lighten our load, and we will serve you forever. Rehoboam had a choice. He could have listened. He could have shown compassion. He could have secured his kingdom for generations. Instead, he let his pride control him. He rejected the wisdom of his father's advisors. He surrounded himself with yes-men who told him what he wanted to hear. And he responded with arrogance and cruelty. My father made your yoke heavy, I will make it even heavier. My father disciplined you with whips, I will discipline you with scorpions. With those words, he shattered the kingdom forever. A leader who refuses to listen creates enemies within his own walls. When Rehoboam mocked the suffering of his people, he assumed they had no choice but to obey him. After all, he was the king. He had the throne. He had the royal army. He thought he was untouchable. But he forgot one thing: loyalty is not demanded, it is earned. And the people were no longer loyal to him. When he ignored their voices, they found another king to follow, Jeroboam, a man they trusted more than their own ruler. 10 tribes left Rehoboam behind and never looked back. This is how bad leadership destroys a nation. When people feel unheard, when they feel oppressed, when they feel like their leaders don't care, they walk away. And what was once a mighty kingdom became 2 weak, divided nations. Rehoboam had everything. He had the resources. He had the throne. He had an empire handed to him. But he lacked wisdom. He thought leadership was about control. He thought strength meant domination. He thought ruling was about forcing people to obey. But true leadership is not about force. It is about influence. The greatest leaders in history did not rule through fear. They ruled through respect. David had it. Solomon had it. Rehoboam lost it. Because wisdom matters more than strength. And when a leader rejects wisdom, his strength means nothing. He thought leadership was about control. He thought strength meant domination. He thought ruling was about forcing people to obey. But true leadership is not about force. It is about influence. The greatest leaders in history did not rule through fear. They ruled through respect. David had it. Solomon had it. Rehoboam lost it. Because wisdom matters more than strength. And when a leader rejects wisdom, his strength means nothing. Rehoboam's failure did not just affect him, it affected millions. The division of Israel led to constant wars. It weakened both nations until they were easy prey for their enemies. It created generations of suffering, exile, and destruction. Because one bad decision does not just affect today, it shapes the future. A single act of arrogance can cost a kingdom. A single refusal to listen can cause a nation to fall. A single moment of pride can rewrite history. And Rehoboam proved it. Rehoboam's story is not just about ancient history, it is about our world today. Because leaders still fall into the same traps. They surround themselves with advisors who tell them what they want to hear. They ignore the voices of the people. They mistake power for wisdom. And they believe they are too strong to fail. But history tells us, no kingdom is too powerful to fall. No nation is too strong to be divided. No leader is too great to be forgotten. Rehoboam thought he was secure. He thought his father's success meant he would succeed. He thought his throne alone would guarantee him power. He was wrong. And his story is a reminder that leadership is not about position, it is about character. Because great leaders do not cling to power. They earn trust. They serve their people. They walk with wisdom. And they listen. The question is, will we? Rehoboam was gone. The kingdom was still divided. And his son Abijah was about to take the throne. Would he restore Judah's strength? Would he heal the wounds his father had caused? Would he learn from history, or would he repeat its mistakes? The king who could have been great. Rehoboam had everything he needed to be great. He had the bloodline of David. The wisdom of Solomon's teachings at his disposal. A kingdom that was already strong, wealthy, and feared by its enemies. Yet, in a matter of days, he lost half of it. Not because he was weak. Not because he was outnumbered. Not because he was betrayed. But because he refused to listen. Because he chose pride over wisdom. And the tragedy of Rehoboam is that he could have been great. He could have ruled a united Israel. He could have led his people into an even greater future. He could have been a name remembered for his victories, not his failures. Instead, his name is a warning. A warning to leaders. A warning to nations. A warning to anyone who thinks power alone is enough to secure greatness. Because history does not remember those who rule by force. It remembers those who rule with wisdom. In the next video, we'll dive into the story of King Abijah, the second king of Judah, who followed in his father's wicked ways. For now, Like this video and share it with your loved ones so more people can learn these powerful biblical lessons. Until then, stay blessed.